This is the fourth MP3 unit for the Genesis module of the field-based SPS. It was recorded by Wilrens Hoornstra on the 22nd of February 2010. Its subject is Genesis chapter 2 through 11. Before you listen to this MP3 or read its script, you should have read the handout on the Gilgamesh epic. Please try to write down a few similarities and differences between this epic and the flood narrative in Genesis. As argued in the previous unit, Genesis 1 functions as a prologue to the book and indeed to the entire Pentateuch. It presents us with God as the sole creator and with humanity as the crown and climax of this creation. Starting in Genesis 2 verse 4, we have an ongoing story presenting humans as the center of creation. The story is written in a simple style, not quite as simple as it perhaps appears at first sight. There are numerous hints or indications that we are to understand chapter 2 and 3 as a symbolic narrative, a literary work of art. It is a portrait, not a photographic picture. This does not make it any less real or less historical. It just means that it does not describe things in the form of straightforward historical narrative. So what are some of these elements or hints? Well, first there is the serpent. He is described as clever. He speaks with Eve and ends up having to eat dust. This is fable-like language. Was this a literal serpent, or does it symbolically represent Satan, which is certainly the case in other passages in Scripture? Interestingly, serpents were an established literary motif in ancient literature, appearing in a variety of roles, quite a few of them negative. Second, God forms the human out of dust. Now, is this literal? And did God indeed blow into this clay figure he had made? Or is this to remind us that we are creatures of the earth, and yet at the same time exist or function on two levels? This image of God as a potter was also a familiar literary motif. In several ancient myths, humans were created by mixing clay with the blood of a god who had been killed. Here too, Genesis confronts us with a higher view of humans. Elsewhere, the Bible speaks of people being formed in the womb using the exact same Hebrew term. Jeremiah 1 verse 5, for instance, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." So it is not just Adam, all of us have been formed or shaped by God. Third, there is the mysterious geography of Eden. It is often suggested that the garden was either near the origin of the Tigris and the Euphrates, close to the mountains of Ararat, or in the plains near the Persian Gulf, where the two rivers flow into the sea. The latter does not fit the geographical description so well, but the Sumerian word Edinu means plain or desert, which does fit a location near the end of Tigris and Euphrates. And it would explain why the garden needed irrigation. The problem is that the other two rivers mentioned, Pishon and Gihon, are unknown to us, and it would seem strange that all four rivers have their origin at the same point, in the river that flows out of Eden. In addition, the river Pishon is linked with Havilah, which many think was located on the Arabian Peninsula, and the river Gihon flows around the land of Cush, that is, part of Sudan. It is hard to imagine a river flowing from the land of Ararat, or from southeastern Iraq all the way to Sudan. So perhaps this is not geographical information, but an expression of the fact that everything the earth needs flows from the presence of God. It is certainly interesting to see how the book of Revelation picks up this motif as a river flowing out of God's presence, as it also picks up the next theme, number 4, the tree of life. Again, this represents a well-known motif from the ancient world, widespread in texts and images. Elsewhere in the Bible it is symbolic. Can we even imagine a fruit that, when eaten, gives immortality? Surely eternal life is not acquired in such a biological or natural way. And then there is, of course, the question of the other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is knowledge of good and evil here? And was this tree literal or not? Is this about knowing by experience? That's very well possible. Or is the knowing active, that is, determining what is good and evil? Perhaps less likely, but it would certainly describe what humanity has been doing ever since, trying to establish its own standard of what is good and what is evil. Either way, it suggests independence and autonomy. The test may well have taken the form of a forbidden fruit, but this is secondary. In some form, this test had to take place. At stake was the foundational direction that humanity will take, with or without God. Will we obey God, or do we insist on being our own Lord? In Eden, humanity declared its independence from God. By the way, we are beginning to see that the real meaning and message of the text does not depend very much on whether we understand it literally or not. 5. The creation of woman from a rib. God's evaluation, it is not good for humans to be alone, certainly expresses a profound psychological insight. Human needs to be in community or in relationship. But did God literally create woman out of man's rib? Or is it intended to convey the intimate relatedness of the two? By the way, the fact that the woman is called helper in chapter 2 verse 18 does not mean that she is man's servant. In the rest of the Bible, the term helper is often used for God, who is our helper, but not our servant. 6. The text includes several word plays. For instance, Adam. It also means human, next to being a personal name. And Adam is taken from Adama, the dust, the earth. It's not quite clear where Adam changes its meaning from a general designation for the human to a personal name. Now, all of this suggests that the type of literature used here is perhaps best described as symbolic narrative. It is not easy to determine where the literal and historical ends and the symbolic begins. I therefore prefer to take a position in between. This is exactly how it was on the one hand, and this is all superstition and myth on the other extreme. A position that takes the text seriously, both as theology and as an event set in time and space, in real history, but that recognizes some elements may be symbols or literary motifs that represent something quite real without describing it literally or in an exact way. In this form, the text tells us about humanity's greatness and humanity's problem. Humans are the image of God, but it is a broken image. They have embraced autonomy and have declared their independence. The text presents us with an analysis of the human condition. It offers a diagnosis. This is what is wrong with us. So, what changed after the fall? We should be careful not to read too much into the text, more than really is there. It does not describe the sweeping, all-encompassing foundational alterations that many people associate with the fall. We tend to have greatly exaggerated ideas about how the world changed when Adam sinned. Suddenly, lions started eating meat instead of grass, mosquitoes began to suck blood, and according to some there was no second law of thermodynamics and therefore no decay before Adam, and certainly no death in any form. But nothing in nature suggests that the world before humans appeared was fundamentally different from the way the world is today. And notice these three things. 1. In chapter 1, the animals are told to be fruitful and multiply. If they never die, how long can they do this until the earth is filled solid with animals? Not very long. Second, plants were eaten, so cells died and were destroyed. That's where we get our energy. But it can only work with the second law of thermodynamics in operation. There is decay. 3. The text does not say that Adam was created immortal and that after the fall, God took immortality away from him. 1 Timothy 6 verse 16 states that only God has immortality. What happened after the fall is not that God changed something in Adam, but that he blocked access to the tree of life. So Adam needed the tree of life to continue living. He did not have immortality in and of himself, but would have needed God's provision to not die. The text does, of course, refers to certain important changes. Agriculture was going to be a lot harder than in the blessed environment of Eden. Childbirth would be more difficult, and the most far-reaching changes that are described in the text are not in nature but in human relationships. The immediate results of the fall include fear, shame, hiding. We all wear masks and are not eager to show our real feelings or thoughts. Blaming. It's the serpent. The woman you gave to be with me. The woman you, God, gave to be with me. Shifting at least part of the blame to God instead of taking responsibility. And then there was a fundamental breakdown of trust, and the original equality of male and female was severely disturbed. After all, chapter 3 verse 16 describes a consequence, not a command. With this, I've largely limited myself to a literary and theological reading of Genesis. Before we move on to chapter 4, I want to briefly discuss the question when Adam and the first humans would have lived. In other words, this is an attempt at a synthetic or holistic reading of the text. And I should probably warn you ahead of time that the result will not be very satisfactorily. But it is at least interesting to think about it. The text seems to place Adam only some thousands of years BC, at the end of the Stone Age or the beginning of the Bronze Age. After all, already in chapter 4 you read about agriculture, the first cities, and the beginning of various technologies like metalworking. The problem with this is that by all appearances humans have been on the earth very much longer. This is not just a scientific problem, but also a textual problem. With Genesis 4, the question often comes up, whom Cain married, of whom he was afraid, and for whom he built a city. Some have thought that this points to the existence of pre-Adamites, humans who lived before Adam. I think that we have roughly three options. One, Genesis 1 to 3 actually took place much longer ago than it appears. These chapters tell us in symbolic language what happened at the dawn of humanity. 2, there were indeed people on the earth when God created Adam not so very long ago. The descendants of Adam later intermingled with these pre-Adamites. And 3, chapter 1 is about the creation of humans, but chapter 2 is not. Adam is not the first human God made, but the first human to whom God revealed himself. John Stott has used the term Homo divinus to express this. Divinus, godly, as opposed to Homo sapiens, the biological, scientific name for humans, Homo divinus. Not the first human being chronologically, but the first human in the sense that he represented humanity before God, and in the sense that he was the first to be spiritually alive, to know God. Now, just as Christ is the head of the new humanity, which includes Old Testament saints who lived before Christ, so Adam would then be the head of the old or the first humanity, which would also include those who lived before Adam, if he is first in the sense of representative. Well, none of these options is an easy solution that answers all the questions. At least I warned you ahead of time. Fact is, with Genesis, as with a number of other things, either we learn to live with open questions, or we have to choose and embrace false certainty. I prefer to live with open questions. So, back to the story. After the fall, chapter 4, things quickly moved downhill. Already in the next generation, we read about the first murder. Cain killed his brother. It is a second fall with a second curse. We then read that Lamech took 2 wives. The first time we read about polygamy. Although the text does not comment on it, it would seem an obvious departure from God's intention for marriage in chapter 2. Worse is that Lamech also committed murder and, different from Cain, boasted in his violent behavior. At least at the end of this chapter, there also are the descendants of Seth who begin to call upon the name of the Lord. At this point, the book inserts a genealogy, which takes us from Adam to Noah in 10 generations. The number 10, as well as the number 7, appears in the book more often. There are, for instance, also 10 generations after the flood, and in chapter 10, 70 nations will be listed, that is, 7 times 10. And later there will be 70 members of Jacob's family who moved to Egypt. The function of such genealogies in these cultures is social or theological rather than historical. We should not use them to construct exact chronologies. It was common to leave out generations. This explains, for instance, why Moses and Aaron, later in Exodus, are only the 4th generation of Israel in Egypt in a time period of more than 400 years. Several generations must have been left out. Important is that there is a connection, a continuing line, and that there is a sense of antiquity, of a long stretch of time between the readers and the beginning. There is an interesting parallel to this list in the form of the Sumerian Kings List, a document, a text that has been found in ancient Sumeria. And this document lists the kings ruling over Sumerian cities before and after the flood. The ages given before the flood are truly fantastic, up to 43,000 years. After the flood, the ages of these kings gradually go back from 1500 to 100 years. At the very least, this shows that the genealogy in Genesis 5 would not have surprised anyone in the ancient world. And it is interesting that in Genesis, it is not a list of kings, but a list of ordinary people who were believers in God.